of a burying place. And there they buried Abraham and Sarah, his wife. There they buried Isaac and Rebekah, his wife. And there I buried Leah. Not Rachel, but Leah. The purchase of the field and of the cave that is therein was from the children of Heth. And when Jacob had made an end of commanding his sons, he gathered up his feet into the bed and yielded up the ghost and was gathered unto his people. Chapter 50, and Joseph fell upon his father's face and wept upon him and kissed him. And Joseph commanded his servants, the physicians, to embalm his father. And the physicians embalmed Israel. And 40 days were fulfilled for him, for so are fulfilled the days of those which are embalmed. And the Egyptians mourned for him 70 days. When the days of his mourning were past, Joseph spake unto the house of Pharaoh, saying, If now I have found grace in your eyes, speak, I pray you, in the ears of Pharaoh, saying, My father may be swear, saying, Lo, I die. In my grave which I have digged for me in the land of Canaan, there shalt thou bury me. Now therefore let me go up, I pray thee, and bury my father, and I will come again. And Pharaoh said, Go up and bury thy father, according as he hath made thee swear. And Joseph went up to bury his father, and with him went up all the servants of Pharaoh, the elders of his house, and all the elders of the land of Egypt, and all the house of Joseph and his brethren in his father's house. Only their little ones and their flocks and their herds they left in the land of Goshen. And there went up with him both chariots and horsemen. It was a very great company. And they came to the threshing floor of Atad, which is beyond Jordan. And there they mourned with a great and very sore lamentation. And he made a mourning for his father 7 days. When the inhabitants of the land, the Canaanites, saw the mourning in the floor of Atad, they said, This is a grievous mourning to the Egyptians. Wherefore the name of it was called Abel Mizraim, which is beyond Jordan. And his sons did unto him according as he had commanded them. For his sons carried him into the land of Canaan and buried him in the cave of the field of Machpelah, which Abraham bought with the field for a possession of a burying place of Ephraim the Hittite before Mamre. And Joseph returned into Egypt, he and his brethren, and all that went up with him to bury his father after he had buried his father. I wanted to read all of those verses because it's one of the most tender scenes in the Bible. The last several weeks we have seen how that Jacob has pronounced those blessings upon his 12 sons, and now it is time to die. And the text seems to indicate that he died peacefully with all of his family gathered around his bedside. It seems to be right after he pronounced those blessings. And then chapter 50 describes in very great detail the mourning, a very long funeral procession to bury Jacob back in the land of Canaan. And this has been a study of the life of Joseph, not the study of the life of Jacob. But we're all familiar with the scoundrel that Jacob had been in his younger life. All of his shortcomings, all of his scheming, all of his failures are very well documented in the book of Genesis. We know about how he stole the birthright from Esau and how that he deceived his father and how he wrestled with the angel and how he wrangled with Laban. We know that later that he was a passive father, that he stood silently by when Dinah was violated by Shechem. He played favorites among his sons. His sons were mostly wild and violent men. But the grace of God has changed Jacob in his older years, and so he is able to finish his race well. I thought tonight would be a good time just to do a study on how men died differently in the Bible. Because some men die in peace and some men die in conflict. There are some men who live a good life but then lose their testimony in their later years and die in shame. And I don't think that anybody came here tonight to say, hey, let's have a Bible study on death. That's such a morbid subject. But death has a 100% success rate. 10 out of 10 people die. And if the Lord tarries, I are going to die. And we ought to be able to desire to say like Paul that I have fought a good fight. I have finished my course. I have kept the faith. That's what I want to say. You may not have started out well, but if you can finish well. That's the goal. Death really is about the last remaining taboo subject that we talk about. We don't sit around and talk about death unless we absolutely have to. When it is staring us in the face and we know that either we or someone that we love is about to be taken, only then do we bring death into the conversation. And even then it is in hushed tones. We try to talk about it without saying the actual word. So we talk about passing over, and we have a lot of euphemisms because there's just something cold and final about the word death. But the Christian's perspective on death is so different than that of the world's. Because while the world sees death as the ultimate defeat, once you've lost a battle with death, there are no more battles. The Christian sees death as the ultimate victory. Paul said in 1 Corinthians 15 and verse 57, but thanks be to God, which giveth us the victory through our Lord Jesus Christ. Death has lost its sting. The grave has lost its victory with the promise of the resurrection. You're not supposed to get out of the grave. But when the believer is snatched from the jaws of death and given new life, that is the ultimate victory. When you win over death, there is no enemy that is greater than that. How vastly different we look at death. And there is something about the death of Jacob that is so instructive for us. Moses, under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, goes to great pains to detail the death and the funeral of this patriarch. In fact, there is more material given to the death of Jacob than there is to Abraham and Isaac put together. He has the longest funeral procession, I guess, of anybody in the Bible. And his death is mentioned in 3 different passages. So it is not just something to pass over. And while everything in his life was not commendable, he was commendable in his death. His greatest testimony was when he lay on his deathbed, and that ought to speak to our hearts tonight. One of the hardest things that I have ever had to do as a pastor is to stand at the bedside of a person who was breathing their last breath. Several times I have been called by family, and I have stood at the hospital at Baptist Sacred Heart, and I have stood there and I've held their hand as they watched their wife or a husband. I've watched a loved one take their last breath. And I've been there as the monitors zeroed out and the nurses came in and very quietly began to turn the machines off. And it's so somber when you know that death is in the room and to witness that. But tonight I want you to visit with me the bedside of Jacob. And I want you to stand there with me tonight as he gathers himself into his bed, as he pulls the covers up to his chin, as he very slowly begins to breathe in and out, and he closes his eyes and waits for death to come. And in this scene, there are 3 very real assurances that Jacob has. There is no turmoil of soul, that there is no conflict, there is no troubled heart. Because as he lays there are 3 things that Jacob knows. And those 3 things that Jacob knows gives him the grace to face the greatest enemy of humanity with strength and with courage. First of all, may I say that Jacob knew when he was leaving. Now, he doesn't know exactly when. He doesn't know the date. He doesn't know the time, if it's tonight or it's tomorrow. But there are some signs that are pointing to his exit. Death can come suddenly. Death can come unexpectedly. But most times death is preceded by warnings. There are 3 times that Jacob talks about his death. I pointed that out before. And he felt like that death was nearer than it really was earlier in his life. I think the first time that he mentioned that he was dying, he actually lived for another 17 years. Missed it by 17 years. But he is getting to the point where as one writer said, he doesn't buy green bananas anymore because they may not have time for them to ripen. I thought that was a clever way of putting it, huh? And the older that we get, the more keenly aware we are of our own mortality. There are several things that warned him, that tells him that your time is ending. One thing, old age warned him that death is approaching. From chapter 47, if you'll flip back to it, chapter 47 and verse number 28, Jacob lived in the land of Egypt 17 years. So the whole age of Jacob was 147 years. So he lives to the ripe old age of 147, even with the fact that men lived longer lives in the patriarchal period. 147, that is still extra innings in the game of life. Psalm 90 verse 18 says that the days of our years are 80 years and 10. And if by reason of strength they be 80 years, yet is their strength labor and sorrow, for it is soon cut off and will fly away. A man's lifespan is given at 70 years. If you get to 80, then you are into overtime. And some die younger and some die older, and some come from strong stock, and their daddy and grandpa lived into their 90s, and they're expecting that. But I don't care how old you get, old age has an expiration date somewhere. There's a warning that death is coming. Then I would say that his diminishing strength warned him that death was coming. Chapter 47, look at verse 31. He said, swear unto me, and he sware unto him. And Israel bowed himself upon the bed's head. Chapter 48 and verse 1, it came to pass after these things that one told Joseph, behold, thy father is sick. He took with him his two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, and one told Jacob and said, behold, thy son Joseph cometh unto thee. And Israel strengthened himself and sat upon the bed. Look at verse number 10. And the eyes of Israel were dim for age, so that he could not see. And in all of these verses, there is the unmistakable sign of waning physical strength. He is in his bed. He has bowed himself. He raises himself up. Word comes to Joseph that his father is sick. His eyesight is dim. And so his body is tired. It's weary from years of toil and struggle. And he can't go on like he did as a young man. For those of us who have reached mid-age and we have started the trek downward on the other side of the hill, we understand a little bit about that. A couple of weeks ago, the young guys, the 20-year-old guys, were playing basketball, and I was in the gym just to watch. And they had an odd number. They needed a fill-in. Well, I played basketball in my day, and so I stepped up to the plate and thought I would fill out one of the slots. And there were several things that night that told me this is not really a good idea. For one thing, when I was a young man, I was a very coveted player. I would have been chosen first, maybe second, surely no more than third. These 20-year-olds all looked at me as an old man and decided to pick their buddies over top of me. I was at least spared the indignity of being chosen last. There was at least one other person that I beat out to get onto a team. But as I began to run up and down the court, my brain was telling me this is not going to end well. After a couple of games, every muscle in my body was telling me how stupid this was. I got home that night and I sat in my recliner where I belonged, trying to find a comfortable spot. Every muscle in my body reminded me that 51 is not the same as 21. Your diminishing strength reminds you death is approaching. Then his diminishing mental capacity warned him that death was approaching. Look at chapter 48, if you would. Look at verse number 5. Jacob says, now thy two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, which were born unto thee in the land of Egypt before I came unto thee into Egypt, are mine, as Reuben and Simeon, they shall be mine. Ephraim and Manasseh are his grandsons. Well, look at verse number 8. And Israel beheld Joseph's sons and said, who are these? One minute he is talking about his grandsons, Ephraim and Manasseh, and the next he's asking, who are those boys? In chapter 49, his mind is still sharp, but old age has a way of touching the memory and the capacity to think quickly. When you ask a prayer request, it just takes me a minute to know what your name is. I know you. I know your name, but just give me a second. It takes a minute to get there. Huh? Then his reminiscing warned him that death was approaching. Look at verse number 5 again. Or verse number 8. verse number 7. As for me, he said, when I came from Padan, Rachel died by me in the land of Canaan in the way. When yet there was but a little way to come unto Ephrath, and I buried there in the way of Ephrath, the same is Bethlehem. One moment in verse number 5, he's in the present. But then he slips into the past for a moment. He starts reminiscing about Rachel and how she died and where she was buried. And then in verse 9 and 10, he's right back into the present. Have you noticed that older people have a tendency to like to talk about the past? And they often will tell you stories that they have told you before. Many, many times, but they don't remember telling you. How many times will they launch into a story of something that happened 20 years ago? You already know it by heart, but you sit and you smile and you nod your head as if this is the first time that you have heard the story. His reminiscing warned him death is coming. Then his desire to put his affairs in order warns him death is approaching. And we saw all of that through Genesis chapter 49. He blesses his sons. He makes them promise that they will bury him in Canaan. He doesn't want to leave anything undone, but he wants to get that final request out before it is too late. And we don't think about that until we feel old age creeping up, and then we think maybe we had better make some arrangements. And so the first lesson tonight is that death is often cheated of the element of surprise. We have warnings and we may not know when, but we know that death is coming. And we could draw some very practical applications from that. Do you have a will? Don't leave the hardest decisions of life left to your relatives. Make those decisions now. I have notes in my office of church members who have given me their funeral plans. This is what I want done at my funeral. I have a lady that gave me her funeral plans probably 20 years ago. She's still here, but she was planning way ahead. She has really outlived herself, and that's fine. But Jacob knew when he was leaving. He knew not the exact time, but he has given enough warnings to set his affairs in order and to be able to face death in peace. He knew when he was leaving. Here's the second thing that Jacob knew. He knew what he was asking. As Jacob lay on that bed, there were two concerns that he had. He had a concern about his boys, and he had a concern about his burial. He has a concern about his boys. Look again at chapter 49. Look at verse number 28. All these are the 12 tribes of Israel. This is it that their father spake unto them and blessed them. Everyone according to his blessing, he blessed them. And we've looked at that for the last several weeks. Jacob looks at his sons and he makes a statement about each one of them. They're called blessings, though some of them sure don't sound like blessings. But he's passing down words of wisdom, passing down words of prophecy, words of legacy. And in those words, we learn so much about those sons. He reaches back into the past and he gives us insight into the character of several of those men. But if you just step back and took a broad view of the chapter, I think that it reveals something about Jacob himself, because this is really his testimony. It tells us that Jacob believed in the unerring prophecies of God, because these words are prophetic. They are prophetic utterances by inspiration of God. Jacob understands he's not just coming up with these as ideas on his own. No, he's speaking by inspiration. This is God saying how this is all going to end up. Some of it was negative, but all of it was God's will. And so you see in that the faith of a man of God, that God would work a mighty nation through his sons. He believed in God's unerring prophecies. He believed in God's unfailing providence. Because the blessings don't speak of just the sons, but of the tribes and the nations that are going to come from those sons. And Jacob knew that one day his sons would be in the land of Canaan, that they would grow into a mighty nation, and that all the nations of the earth would be blessed through them. And I think foremost on his mind when he faced death is to know that my family is okay. My family will be taken care of. I think it would be an undescribable grief to die estranged from your children, or to die not having peace about their spiritual life. These prophecies are called blessings. That's exactly what you want to pass on to your children. The death would be much more welcome if I can go knowing that my children are in a good place spiritually. They are equipped to continue life's journey without me. He has a concern for his boys. But then he has a concern for his burial. And most men really don't care where you bury them. Just put me in a pine box and dig a hole in the woods. Don't spend no money. Don't make a big deal. Don't have a big funeral because it's not me that you're putting in the ground. Not so with Jacob. No, he is very, very concerned about his burial. You're going to take my body back to Canaan and you're going to bury me with my fathers. Come back to chapter 46 if you would. Chapter 46, and this is where he is coming to Egypt. God speaks to him one night to assure him, and if you'll just skip down to verse number 3, God says, I am God, the God of thy father. Fear not to go down into Egypt, for I will make of thee a great nation. I will go down with thee into Egypt, and I will also surely bring thee up again. Chapter 47. Chapter 47, verse 29. The time drew near that Israel must die, and he called his son Joseph and said unto him, If now I have found grace in thy sight, put, I pray thee, thy hand under my thigh, and do kindly and truly with me. Bury me not, I pray thee, in Egypt. But I will lie with my fathers, and thou shalt carry me out of Egypt, and bury me in their burying place. And he said, I will do as thou hast said. And he said, Swear unto me. And he sware unto him. So he's very concerned that my burial is in Egypt. And I think that you probably already know this, that those expressions are really statements of faith. His prophecies about the boys are a statement of faith, but his request about his burial is a statement as faith as well. He's not superstitious, but I believe that he's spiritual. He knew that Abraham and Isaac were buried in the promised land, and he knew that God had promised him that he would bring him out of Egypt. And he knows the prophecy of Genesis 15, where they will be in Israel in a strange land afflicted for 400 years, but there would come a deliverance. And Egypt was never home to him, and it would be a great expense, and it's going to be a lot of trouble. But don't leave me in Egypt. You take me back to Canaan. Concerned about his burial. But I think it's not just that he believed it, but I think he wanted his sons to believe it. They may have not had the confidence. In fact, they may not have even had the desire to go back to Canaan, but they knew that their father wanted that. And it's not so much a personal desire as it was a desire to be a testimony to his sons in his dying hour. So he dies in a way as to leave no doubt about his faith in God. If he knew the promises to his grandfather Abraham, he knew it would be a long time before his descendants would go back to Canaan, that they would be afflicted for 400 years in a strange land, and Egypt was that strange land, and he knew that his sons and his grandsons were going to face persecution in this strange land, and it all looked good right now, but that's going to change. There is going to come some deep affliction, but he wanted them to look forward as well, believe the promises of God, and know that God will deliver you from slavery to freedom. God will bring you back. That's the testimony of his burial. It had nothing to do with geography. It had everything to do with theology. He is not at home in Egypt. He's home somewhere else. And Jacob wanted to be a witness to his family that they did not belong in the land of Egypt either. When Jacob gathered his family together, the 70 souls, and they moved to Egypt, he did so with the promise of God in his heart. So his dying request is, don't bury me in this strange land. Bury me in the land of my fathers. So you get to chapter 50. And in chapter 50, you have the longest funeral and funeral procession recorded in the Bible. I won't read it again. I'll just very quickly sketch it. Joseph takes 40 days to embalm their father. It's believed that Egyptians were the first to embalm bodies. Basically, the way it worked, the more money you had, the more embalming you got. He embalmed him for 40 days. And then the Egyptians mourned for Jacob for 70 days. Now, what's significant about that is that pharaohs were mourned for 72 days. When a pharaoh died, the entire nation mourned for 70 days. Jacob's not a pharaoh. Jacob is a shepherd. Shepherds are despicable to Egyptians, but yet they mourned him almost as long as they would mourn a Pharaoh. What a testimony that Jacob had in that land. That the lost world mourned for him like they would a king. And then there's the long train that's headed to Canaan, to the place of Machpelah. In that train is all of Joseph's brothers, all of their families. A very large entourage from the household of Pharaoh. And when Jacob was finally laid to rest in the cave of Machpelah, it was a very clear statement that this is where I belong. I'll just give you a little side note, Years earlier, Abraham had purchased that field that had that cave, and that became the family cemetery, this family burial plot. Abraham and Sarah were buried there. And Isaac and Rebekah were buried there. You remember Jacob had two wives, Rachel and Leah, and though he loved Rachel, Leah is buried there. Rachel is not. Rachel died on the way to Ephrath, and they buried her at Ephrath. And it's just striking to me, and maybe I'm reading more into it than what is there, but when he said, bury me, it's not bury me beside the wife that I loved all of my life, Rachel. No, instead he is buried beside Leah in the cave of Machpelah. I think that he would want to be buried next to the wife that he loved, that God would have him buried beside Leah. I think that you could say that he loved Rachel, but he loved the promises of God even more. As Jacob lays on that bed, he knew when he was leaving. And Jacob knew what he was asking. But here's the third assurance that helped him die. He knew where he was going. Look, if you would, in chapter 49 and verse 29. He charged them and said unto them, I am to be gathered unto my people. Bury me with my fathers in the cave that is in the field of Ephron the Hittite. Now at first it sounds like that Jacob is saying he would be gathered to his people when he is buried with his fathers. But it is really written so that it is two different statements. He's going to be gathered to his people long before they take his body back to Canaan. Before they lay his body in that cave of Machpelah, he's going to be gathered to his people already. In fact, his reunion with his fathers in the burial plot is only symbolic of a reunion that has taken place a long time before. These patriarchs believed in a resurrection, and Jacob knew that it would only be his body laid to rest, but he would not be there. He would already be gathered to his people. The thought of a believer is, put me anywhere you want to put me, because I'm not going to be there anyway. He knew where he was going. Now, I understand tonight that we're in the Old Testament. I understand that the Old Testament saints didn't go to heaven. I'm not preaching tonight that he went to heaven. I'm not preaching the reunion is like your reunion. I understand paradise. I understand that. But he says, gather me, I'll be gathered unto my people. He is expecting a reunion is what he is expecting. I was looking at this passage this week in a motel room and trying to formulate how that we would approach this. I knew that sitting here, there are people who in the last year, 2 years, you've lost somebody. And so a passage like this becomes very real. It becomes very raw. It brings back all of those emotions. And I thought about Brother Kent. And I thought about Sister Sharon. And I thought about your loved ones. And you know as well as I do, to be able to say that one of these days that there'll be a happy reunion, that we will see each other again. It takes all the sting out of death. It takes the victory out of the grave. He knew where he was going. So I ask you 2 questions tonight from this passage, something to ponder on. 2 questions. Question number 1, do you know where you're going? Now it's Wednesday night Bible study. Only Christians go to Wednesday night Bible study. Nobody gets saved on a Wednesday night. Only on Sunday mornings do people get saved. But if you're here tonight and you don't know where you are going, if I was to ask you tonight, do you know for sure that heaven is your home? If you cannot say that with 100% assurance in your heart tonight, there is no other question for you. Do you know where you're going? Here's my second question. Do you know that you're not going soon? Do you know that you're not going soon? How many years do you have left on this earth? How many days can you count? Are you prepared, or are you preparing for death, or are you just rolling the dice that life will just keep rolling on forever with no end? Will the testimony of our death be as strong as the testimony of our life? He knew where he was going. Do you know where you're going? And do you know that you're not going soon? Are you preparing for that day?